had already grown to 38 people. Lewiston continued to grow, as did the Garcelon family. The family served the town in many ways. When James died at his home in Lewiston on November of 1813, he had made Pierre Garcelon, once a Roman Catholic priest, the forefather of 118 family members, many of whom were living in Lewiston at the time. James' funeral gathering could very well have been described not only as Lewiston's largest gathering of Franco-Americans, but a gathering of family who had made the most contributions to the town of Lewiston. Just picture the Garcelon family gathered together to celebrate James' life. At that celebration, 6-month-old Alonzo Garcelon, James' youngest great-grandson, was in the arms of his mother, Mary. He had suddenly become the hope of all the family to carry forward the advice that Pierre had given James over 60 years before, on that cold January day in 1750. We know that James had saved all 11 of Pierre's letters and passed them on to his family. When Alonzo became old enough, they were read to him in the language they were written, French, and they were used to educate him not only in the language, but also as a moral lesson. What a great way to educate a child who is to become a leader, not only in Lewiston, but also in Maine and the United States. When Alonzo was born, the War of 1812 was almost 11 months old, and the Embargo Acts of 1806-1808, created by Thomas Jefferson and the U.S. Congress, were affecting merchants in New England who depended on trade with England and her Canadian colonies. Alonzo's grandfather, William, who opened the first store in Lewiston, also had a store at Southwest Bend in Durham and one at his shipyard in Freeport. He operated a shipbuilding business with John Lane in Freeport. The Embargo Acts hurt his businesses badly. In October of 1808, William Sr. and Maria, and all of their children except William Jr., who was 22 at the time, and soon to marry Mary Davis, moved to Oak Bay in New Brunswick to escape the debilitating effects of the Embargo Acts. They returned to Lewiston 38 years later. By the time Alonzo was born, his father, Colonel William Garcelon, had taken over his father's business interests in town, including the store. Colonel William is remembered as a leading citizen of Lewiston during his lifetime of 1786 to 1872. He held many civic offices, such as town clerk, selectman, collector of taxes, representative to the legislature, colonel in the state militia, surveyor, justice of the peace, and probate court judge. His interest in education in Lewiston was summarized in a 12-page report he wrote. His journals are still referred to today when researchers are writing about the Lewiston area. He was born 9 years before Lewiston was chartered as a town. He lived through the presidencies of 18 presidents, from George Washington to Ulysses S. Grant. He saw Lewiston change counties, become a town, then a city, and he saw Maine become a state. When William died in 1872, Lewiston's evening journal's lengthy obituary described William as a Christian patriarch and venerated citizen who had died at the home of his son, Dr. Garcelon. When William died, Alonzo was almost 59 years old, and for many of those years he and his father had been inseparable. Their love for Lewiston and its people was palpable, but they did far more than talk about these feelings. Alonzo's education started young. In 1818, his father took the 4.5-year-old Alonzo to an auction of pews at the newly constructed meeting house called the Old South Church. William had been on the building committee. A bucket of water sweetened with a portion of West Indian rum was provided. Alonzo and another lad were foolishly given a supply of the drink by the lad's father. Alonzo soon became oblivious to his surroundings and stayed that way for some time. But the lesson of temperance preached by the Garcelon family was learned very, very quickly. In the first 16 years of his life, Alonzo attended local schools and worked on his father's farm. For many years later, he recalled those were the happiest days of his life. Alonzo soon exhausted the limited educational opportunities Lewiston provided at the time. Because his family had the financial resources and shared belief in the value of education, Alonzo was able to leave the area to pursue his schooling. In 1829, he entered Monmouth Academy and was there for 18 months before graduating as valedictorian of his class. He later attended Waterville Academy, then Newcastle Academy. Newcastle Academy cost William and Mary 1 bushel of wheat, 1 shilling, and the expense of Alonzo's room and board at Captain Taylor's. If you don't mind me taking this off before I melt. In November of 1832, Alonzo was admitted to Bowdoin College. During his 4 years at Bowdoin, he studied Greek, Latin, philosophy, chemistry, economics, mathematics, mineralogy, and studied medicine with Dr. Reuben Mussey. He also obtained his teaching certificate while at Bowdoin. Between terms, Alonzo obtained teaching assignments at local schools. During one teaching stint in 1832-1833, he taught 37 pupils at Garcelon's Ferry for 15 weeks for $26.25. For those of you who are familiar with school finances, this was a cost of $1.41 per student per term, or 9.3 cents per student per week. Try that now. Alonzo set his sights high, but could not decide what to do for a profession. On June 20th, 1837, he wrote to the beautiful Anne Waldron, whom he was courting, and said, "I would indeed that I could stand upon the summit of the hill of science and survey the paths I had trod, but alas, this will never be permitted to mortals. I would plod on, however, and should my life be spared, I hope one day to gain an eminence whereon few have trod and which shall command the admiration of the world." Shortly after writing this, Alonzo watched Dr. Mussey operate on one of his uncles in Lewiston. Alonzo then chose his profession. He followed Dr. Mussey to Dartmouth College and later followed him to the Medical College of Ohio in Cincinnati. After many years of study, performing operations and practicing medicine, Alonzo successfully completed his exam as a doctor in February of 1839. He continued as a private pupil of Dr. Mussey while considering seeking his fortune in the West. William and Mary begged Alonzo to return home to Lewiston. Finally, the dutiful son arrived back home in October of 1839. When Alonzo returned home as a physician, the town had grown to nearly 1,800 people. The foundations for change had already been laid in this farming and lumbering community. Even before Alonzo completed his education as a physician, he had a part in its growth. The first bridge across the Androscoggin River lasted from 1823 to 1837 when it washed out. The second bridge was built with the efforts of many in the two communities, including Alonzo. His father William and capitalists from Boston, whom they had encouraged to participate. William and Alonzo owned shares in that bridge. In 1834, Alonzo and William were listed as investors in the Lewiston Falls Manufacturing Company. Alonzo had not been back in Lewiston very long when the smallpox epidemic broke out in Minot. The community leaders put Alonzo in charge of the 36 people who had or were exposed to the disease, and he saved them all. As the epidemic spread throughout the state, his reputation grew. He saved many more people, and at the same time trained many doctors how to deal with the epidemic. He also created smallpox vaccine with his own cows. By now, Alonzo was committed to staying in Lewiston and serving the area. From the early 1840s until he died in 1906, he accomplished so much that no single presentation of any reasonable length could ever tell it all. However, I'll give you some more highlights of Alonzo's life. All of his contributions to the community, whether as a physician, educator, entrepreneur, or politician were aimed at improving the community for its people. He was a patriot in the truest sense, and his love of his country, state, and community kept him from becoming a good politician. But he excelled in all his efforts to promote the growth and improvement of the area. On August 19, 1841, Alonzo married his sweetheart, Anne Augusta Waldron. Their first child, Charles Augustus Garcelon, was born on November 14, 1842. Alonzo and Anne were to have 6 other children. 3 of the children, Mary Ann William and Mary Abby, all died before reaching the age of 3. Alonzo not only practiced medicine, but he's also very involved in improving medical practice from the time he returned to Lewiston from Ohio in 1839 until he died in 1906. He was a founding member of the Maine Medical Association, the Androscoggin Medical Association. He was a member of the American Medical Association, and he was a chairman of the board for the American Medical Association. In Lewiston, he was an incorporator and officer of the Lewiston General Hospital, a staff consulting physician at both surgeon at both the Central Maine Hospital and the Asylum of Our Lady of Lourdes. From 1861 to 1865, he was a Surgeon General for all the Maine regiments in the Civil War. And the U.S. government also made him the chief surgeon for the U.S. Army 2nd Corps in 1864. His contributions to medical education, writing and lecturing were renowned. He practiced well into his 90s. He was a familiar sight in the area as he tended to patients in his horse and chaise. Perhaps one of the better-known stories about him is this. On a cold, stormy night of February 1894, he was asked to attend a patient in Poland. Alonzo set out in the dark and snow, and after crossing the river and entering the woods, his horse and sleigh went off the road into a large snowbank. The 80-year-old doctor unhitched the horse and brought him back up onto the road. Then he went back and pulled the sleigh onto the road. By this time, the horse had bolted. Alonzo followed the horse for 2 miles before catching him and bringing him back to the sleigh. He then went on to attend his patient, drove back home in the snowstorm to Lewiston, attended his horse, and then went to bed. The next morning, he began a new day. Many years later, without knowing the story, I had been taught by my grandfather, a man always feeds and beds his horse before he feeds and beds himself. Garcelon Field at Bates College and the Alonzo Garcelon Society give us a hint of Alonzo's efforts to bring excellent education to the area. Alonzo knew Orrin Cheney long before Orrin petitioned the state legislature in 1854 to charter a school. Alonzo and Orrin were at Dartmouth College together. At the same time in the late 1830s, Orrin would go about the campus preaching temperance, and Alonzo came from a well-known temperance family in Maine. In addition, Alonzo's uncle, James Garcelon, had been a Baptist minister in Lewiston Plantation. Alonzo and his father, William, had long fought for free publication in Lewiston. Alonzo was the guiding spirit in creating the Harper Library Association in 1845, formed very specifically to teach young children reading. Alonzo had also known Benjamin Bates for many years and had tirelessly encouraged Bates to spend his capital in Lewiston. Bates opened his first mill in Lewiston in 1852, and anecdotal history says that Bates' first office was behind Alonzo's home. In addition, Alonzo was a Maine state senator when the petition for the school's charter was presented to the legislature in 1854. Alonzo at 41 was in the prime of his life, and he was determined that the Maine State Cemetery, which later became Bates College, was going to be in Lewiston. Less than 2 years later, the cornerstone for the first building was laid. 1 year later, the first class opened, and 2 years after that, the college was debt-free. Alonzo was a trustee and instructor at Bates for many years. It was Alonzo who convinced others to contribute large amounts of money to Bates, including Benjamin Bates, who made a gift of $100,000.